Deuteronomy 32. Hear the word of the Lord. Then Moses spoke the words of this song until they were finished in the ears of all the assembly of Israel. Give ear, O heavens, and I will speak, and let the earth hear the words of my mouth. May my teaching drop as the rain, my speech distill as the dew, like gentle rain upon the tender grass, and like showers upon the herb. For I will proclaim the name of the Lord, ascribe greatness to our God. The rock, his work is perfect, for all his ways are justice, a God of faithfulness and without iniquity. Just and upright is he. They have dealt corruptly with him. They are no longer his children, because they are blemished. They are a crooked and twisted generation. Do you thus repay the Lord, you foolish and senseless people? Is not he your father who created you, who made you and established you? Remember the days of old. Consider the years of many generations. Ask your father, and he will show you, your elders, and they will tell you. When the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. But the Lord's portion is his people, Jacob his allotted heritage. He found him in a desert land and in the howling waste of the wilderness. He encircled him. He cared for him. He kept him as the apple of his eye, like an eagle that stirs up its nest, that flutters over its young, spreading out its wings, catching them, bearing them on its pinions. The Lord alone guided him. No foreign god was with him. He made him ride on the high places of the land, and he ate the produce of the field, and he suckled him with the honey out of the rock and oil out of the flinty rock, curds from the herd and milk from the flock, with fat of lambs, rams of Bashan, and goats, with the very finest of the wheat. And you drank foaming wine made with the blood of the grape. But Jerushan grew fat and kicked. You grew fat, stout, and sleek. Then he forsook God who made him, and scoffed at the rock of his salvation. They stirred him to jealousy with strange gods. With abominations they provoked him to anger. They sacrificed to demons that were no gods, to idols they had never known, to new gods that had come recently, whom your fathers had never dreaded. You were unmindful of the rock that bore you, and you forgot the God who gave you birth. The Lord saw it and spurned them because of the provocation of his sons and his daughters. And he said, I will hide my face from them. I will see what their end will be. For they are a perverse generation, children in whom is no faithfulness. They have made me jealous with what is no God. They have provoked me to anger with their idols. So I make them jealous with those who are no people. I will provoke them to anger with a foolish nation. For a fire is kindled by them, and it burns to the depths of Sheol, devours the earth and its increase, and sets on fire the foundations of the mountains. And I will heap disasters upon them, and I will spin my arrows on them, and they shall be wasted with hunger and devoured by plague and poisonous pestilence. And I will send the teeth of beasts against them, with the venom of things that crawl in the dust. Outdoors the sword shall bereave, and indoors terror. For young man and woman alike, the nursing child and the man of gray hairs. I would have said, I will cut them to pieces. I will wipe them from human memory. But had I not feared provocation by the enemy, lest their adversaries should misunderstand, lest they should say, our hand is triumphant. It was not the Lord who did all this. For they are a nation void of counsel, and there is no understanding in them. If they were wise, they would have understood this. They would discern their latter end. How could one have chased 1,000 and two put 10,000 to flight, unless their rock had sold them and the Lord had given them up? For their rock is not as our rock. Our enemies are by themselves. For their vine comes from the vine of Sodom and from the fields of Gomorrah. Their grapes are grapes of poison. Their clusters are bitter. Their wine is the poison of serpents and the cruel venom of asp. Is not this laid up in store with them, sealed up in my treasuries? Vengeance is mine and recompense for the time when their foot shall slip. For the day of their calamity is at hand, and their doom comes swiftly. For the Lord will vindicate his people and have compassion on his servants when he sees that their power is gone and there is none remaining, bond or free. Then he will say, where are their gods, the rock in which they took refuge, who ate the fat of their sacrifices and drank of the wine of their drink offerings? Let them rise up and help you. Let them be your protection. See, now that I, even I, am He, and there is no God beside me, I kill and I make alive. I wound and I heal, and there is none that can deliver out of my hand. For I lift up my hand to heaven and swear, as I live forever, if I sharpen my flashing sword and my hand takes hold on judgment, I will take vengeance on my adversaries and will repay those who hate me. I will make my arrows drunk with blood, and my sword shall devour flesh, and the blood of the slain and the captives from the long-haired heads of the enemy. Rejoice with him, O heavens. Bow down to him, all gods, for he avenges the blood of his children and takes vengeance on his adversaries. He repays those who hate him and cleanses his people's lands. Moses came and recited all the words of the song in the hearing of the people, he and Joshua the son of Nun. And when Moses had finished speaking all the words to all Israel, he said to them, take to heart all the words by which I am warning you today, that you may command them to your children, that they may be careful to do all the words of this law. For it is no empty word for you, but your very life. And by this word you shall live long in the land that you are going over the Jordan to possess. May the Lord add his blessings to the reading of his holy word. Well, ever met someone who turned out to be very different than who you first thought? Maybe you underestimated someone. You thought that he was just an average person, but he turned out to be some big shot. I had a job as a kind of watchman at my seminary in California, Fuller Theological Seminary, which has three schools, the School of Theology, the School of Missions, and the School of Psychology. And one day I saw a man using the copying machine for the theology professors whom I didn't recognize. Is this some kind of vagrant who came off the streets, doing something he's not supposed to be doing? So I went up to him, asked him who he was, and he said, I'm Donald McGavern. He's the founder of the School of Missions, and probably the most important missionary of the 20th century. Good thing I asked him before kicking him off the property. Well, how about you? Ever underestimated someone? Maybe you thought you were having a conversation with just someone who knew as much as you did, but it turns out he or she's an expert. You started talking maybe about your health, you have this pain, and he or she responds, and you think, no, that's probably wrong. But it turns out he or she's a doctor, a specialist. You didn't know you were dealing with a real expert. Well, last fall, I got into an online conversation with a man about Vanderbilt football's woman kicker, and he said that she did a squib kick, and I said, no, a squib kick is a low line drive kick, made in order to make it difficult to catch, thinking I was informing this football novice, this guy online who really probably didn't know football very well, not like me, who've been watching it for years. I was educating this guy on football. And he responded with both amusement and a sense of confidence that you could tell, he felt he knew what he was talking about. And I thought, then I began to wait. I thought, who am I dealing with? And so I Googled his name, and I found out he's the kicking coach at the University of Florida, a former long-term NFL kicker and Pro Bowl player. He is a true world-class expert in football kicking. So it's important to know who you are dealing with. In the World War II Battle of the Bulge, the Germans sent out English-speaking spies behind American lines dressed in American uniforms to cause havoc and do sabotage. And so the Americans countered that by setting up checkpoints where the U.S. soldiers, when they passed through, they would ask them questions about America that most Americans should know. When General Omar Bradley was the commanding, at least the field general, the general on the ground of the Americans of the battle, when he was passing through, they stopped him and they asked him, hey, what's the capital of Illinois? General Bradley answered, Springfield. And the U.S. soldier thought, aha, I caught one. Everyone knows it's Chicago. And so he detained the general. It's important to know who you're dealing with and the capital of Illinois. A common theme of some TV shows and movies is an encounter in which one person doesn't know who he's dealing with. That was the premise of the whole show, The Undercover Boss, if you ever saw it. There's a CEO or some owner or big boss of a big company, puts on a disguise, and then he goes to work in his own company as if he's just a lowly employee. Now, he or she would hear things about the company that they would never hear if they just asked them, if the person knew who they were dealing with. In the movie Bruce Almighty, Jim Carrey's selfish character is this selfish guy, and he first encounters God, supposedly played by Morgan Freeman, as a janitor, and he blows him off when the undercover God asks him to help mop. It's a biblical theme too, with Hebrews chapter 13, verse 2, telling us to be hospitable and generous, because you never know. People have entertained angels unawares, it says. Probably referring to when Abraham and Sarah hosted 3 men who were passing by, who turned out to be angels, one of them the Lord himself. Even Jesus says that at the last judgment, people are going to be told that the good thing they did, the food or the clothes they shared, the visit they made, the hospitality they showed, or maybe for some, the things they didn't do. They didn't share food or clothes and ignored people in need, that was really done to the Lord, as you've done to the least of these. Jesus says in Matthew chapter 25, verse 40, you've done it to me. It's really very important to know who you're dealing with. Here in Deuteronomy 32, we see what happens when people forget who they're dealing with. We see that in a song that is meant in 4 parts to remind us of who we are dealing with. And those 4 parts, 1, God's eternal majesty; 2, God's past generosity; then God's present jealousy; and finally, God's future mercy and severity. What might strike us as odd is that these reminders of who God is, who we're dealing with, they come in a song. At the end of chapter 21, where we read, Moses spoke the words of the song. He gave them these lyrics. It's meant to be sung. We don't know the tune exactly. That hasn't been preserved. But there's some tune that goes along with it that people were to learn, and they sang this. Last week from Deuteronomy 31, we saw that this song was intended to be a witness against them. So when judgment comes, the song will be evidence back to them of why they are now being punished, why they are going through this judgment they are experiencing. Many Christians today find that weird because most of us don't think that that's what music and singing is for. It's for, I think we just kind of assume it's just for our entertainment, it's for our emotional release, or just for our sentimental value, like we talked about last week. The purpose of singing for many church people, I think, seems to be no more profound than, I like that song. Often singing is treated as the warm-up act for the preaching, just to get you in the mood. We often don't think songs are to be reminders of who we're dealing with. I think if you ask particularly most Reformed people to come up with a way to remind the church about their covenant with God and about who God is, they'd respond, with a catechism, maybe a teaching series, maybe a book, but it would probably never occur to them to write and sing a song. When it comes to learning about God, who we're dealing with, Reformed people usually talk about teaching, preaching, maybe reading good books, learning a catechism, but they'll rarely mention singing, almost as if it's too emotional or soulish. Something. We shouldn't be too emotional or soulish, as if we're not to love God with all our soul. But God often gives us songs. Psalms is a song book right in the middle of the Bible. The New Testament twice commands us to sing psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. It's on that verse right there, Colossians chapter 3. Songs give expression of the soul. And that's exactly what God does here. He gives them a song to impress on their soul who they're dealing with. That's why we're reminded of who we're dealing with, not just through cerebral lessons, but through a song to express with the soul who we're dealing with. Well, first we sing about God's eternal majesty. In verse 1, give ear, O heavens, that's the universe, like the galaxies, the stars, outer space. Give ear. I will speak. Then let the earth, this planet, let it also hear the words of my mouth. So all of creation, heavens and earth, praise of God's eternal majesty then falls like rain that refreshes the brown grass, turning it green, on the herbs, making them flourish and fragrant. People need to hear about the greatness of God. People today who are raised being told that they're the greatest, and kind of always puffed up, need to be told of someone who is infinitely greater. So they see themselves in perspective with God. And so get humbled by that. To get their minds off of themselves and praise God. Praising God refreshes. So in verse 3, proclaim the name of the Lord, the name of Jesus. Confess the name of Jesus and declare that he is the Lord to the glory of God the Father. Ascribe greatness, not to yourself all the time. Ascribe greatness, not to anything that serves you, like your family or your money or even the country, like next week on July 4th, but to our God. At least that's what we're here for. You want to ascribe greatness to the country? You can do that elsewhere. But here, by ascribing greatness to our God, hearing and singing the praises of God of his eternal majesty is refreshing to our soul. C.S. Lewis wrote that, quote, the humblest and at the same time the most balanced and capacious, that's large, kind of open minds, praise most, while the cranks, the misfits, and the malcontents praise the least. Praise seems to be inner health made audible. That is, if you're not narcissistic, you don't think everything is about you, and you can see the greatness of God, you will praise. You will want to sing praises. Ascribe greatness, not to ourselves, but to our God. How great is our God. After all, he's our rock in verse 4, our foundation, what our life is to be based on. His work is perfect. Not like our works, which are always flawed. For his work is perfect because all his ways are justice. That is, they are just, they are right, and they produce justice. They produce the right result, the right outcome. Now, there's an increasing amount of confusion about what justice is in today's culture, with some people insisting that, quote, justice is everyone getting the same result, equality of outcome, so-called equity. And they're trying to redefine justice, but here all God's ways are justice because God defines what justice is. It's getting what one deserves, according to God, what is right, not equality of outcome. Because in the end, as we see, particularly see in this chapter, there's not equality of outcome, is there? There's severity for some, there's mercy for others. If you live by God's ways, you'll get a different outcome than if you live opposed to his ways, in rebellion against him, if you're his adversary. The evil get a different outcome than the righteous. And those unequal outcomes are justice. God the judge decreed them. He issued the verdict that produces them. God's work is perfect because all his ways are justice. So sing his praise because he's also, in verse 4, a God of faithfulness. This is part of who, over and over in the Old Testament. His steadfast love, which already incorporates the idea of faithfulness. Steadfast is faithful. Steadfast love and faithfulness. That is, he keeps his commitments. He doesn't make a promise and then gets kind of tired of keeping it. You know, this turned out to cost me more than I thought, so I'm going to break it. Look at it and think, well, keeping this promise is costing me too much, so never mind. No, he's not like that. In Psalm 15, the person who gets to live with God is, among other things, the one who swears to his own hurt and does not change. In other words, he makes a promise that he keeps, even if it turns out to cost a lot. The reason such a person lives with God is because God is like that too. He swears. He makes a covenant. He makes a commitment to his own hurt. In other words, that it cost him a lot. And he does not change. He swore, he made a covenant to save his people. And to keep that covenant, he had to come in human flesh, the incarnation, and go to the cross. That's a lot of hurt. But he did not change. He's faithful and without sin, without anything corrupt. Just and upright is he. So, sing his praises. That's what we do when we care about something, right? We praise it. If you really care about something, your championship basketball or football, or could have been championship baseball team, or your son or daughter graduating or getting married, or maybe the country on July 4th, you don't feel complete until you get to tell it, to announce it, tell others. We enjoy praising what we love. The praise completes the enjoyment. So having encountered God's eternal majesty, having a life that is founded on the rock, that's a theme throughout this chapter, the rock. There's their rock, there's unsure rocks, and there's the rock. Seeing the perfection of his works, we want to praise, and that's part of why we come here, isn't it? We are a gathering of people who yearn to ascribe greatness to our God. Second, we sing about God's past generosity from verses 5 to 18. And in verse 6, he says, God is their Father who created them, who made them and established them, who put them on a rock so that they weren't unstable people, temporary, flighty people, like most of the other nations. You read the Old Testament, you see all these names of nations that don't exist anymore. What happened to them? Well, they were founded on sand. They disappeared. Not God's people, though. They're founded on the rock. In verse 7, remember the days of old. Take a sentimental journey. Consider the past. Ask the old folks here, particularly ask your father, he says. They'll tell you. The Most High allotted the land for every nation. He set their borders. Their inheritance was land, was their territory. But in verse 9, the Lord's portion, that is his inheritance, is his people. It's an important theme also in this chapter, in the whole Old Testament. The Lord's inheritance, his portion, the equivalent for him of us having land that we inherit, equivalent for him is having a people that he inherits. The heritage he allotted himself, he calls it here, is Jacob, which Genesis tells us is the assembly. That's the gathering of his people from all nations. The Lord's portion, his heritage, is his people. And at the very end of the song, it literally says in Hebrew, and I read the ESV as it presented to us, but I disagree with it here, because it literally says in Hebrew, in verse 43, his land, his people. They translated it, cleanses his people's land, but it literally says his land, his people, thus equating the land with the people. That's his inheritance. He chose to be their father, a father to them, to care for them, because they're his people, his inheritance. In the past, he found his people in a desert land, in verse 10, like he finds a dry and weary land where there is no water. In other words, there's nothing life-giving there. It's a place where living things die, but he surrounded them with care, keeping them, as he says, the apple of his eye, that is protecting them like we instinctively protect our eyes, don't we? Especially our pupils. It's a sensitive part of the body. Something starts coming for our eyes, we just immediately, a defense mechanism kicks in. We protect our eyes, especially our pupils. We have that defense mechanism toward the pupils of our eyes, or the apples of our eye. And so the Lord here is saying that he reflexively, immediately guards his people, like we guard our eyes. Guards them with an instant help. Like a father, then in verse 11, like a mother eagle hovering above her chicks, spreading her wings, feeding and guarding them. And so too, in verse 12, the Lord guarded his people. Not any other God. It wasn't money or family or the government that protected and provided. It was the Lord. The Lord gave his people a ride. That is, he carried them in verse 13. That Footprints poem gets that right. He gave his people fresh produce, good fruit, suckled them on honey and refreshed them with oil. Out of rocks, no less. How do you get fresh water and oil out of rocks? No, but the Lord does it. The Lord caused even the rocks, which naturally produce nothing, to produce sweetness and refreshing for his people. When the Lord is carrying you, even the rocks, it's the hard, lifeless things of the world, and give you nourishment. He can bring nourishment and joy from them. The Lord gave them milk, curds. That's like, for us, maybe like yogurt, maybe like tofu. The Lord gave them tofu in verse 14 with the best lambs, good mutton, maybe curry mutton too, high grain, wheat. Gave them sweet wine in abundance. Sing of the past generosity of the Lord. Be amazed by his generosity to you. That's what he's saying here. It's part of the song. Sing of the abundance that he's given you. All this extravagance that he's poured out on you. Sing about it. Dave Ramsey says that, quote, generosity is God's way of creating community. That is, you're generous with someone. You know, you do them a favor. You give them what they need, maybe money or maybe things, some service. And they are, or should be, grateful. So they feel connected to you. And then if sometime later you have a need, well, they feel like sharing with you too. It's not like a business relationship, a quid pro quo. No, that's based on pay. You know, Food Lion isn't generous to me when I shop there. I don't feel connected to them. Right? I don't go up with a pint of ice cream and ask, I really like some of this. I don't have money with them right now. Do you mind sharing? Next time I'll share some with you. They look at me, no, I'm a cashier. What are you talking to bargain with me? No, there's no connection to them. They're not generous with me. I'm not generous with them. If another store opens up that provides us good products for the same or less money, I'll feel no loyalty at all to Food Lion and so gladly shop at the new place. But when someone is generous with us, with me, if they're interested in me, if they give to me, hopefully the same for you, and then you feel connected, don't you? I do. And so you be generous back to them. You share with them. And so community is created like that. Here God has been generous to his people. And they should, because of that, feel connected to him in a community with God. They should see him as their caring father. It's not just like a service provider and then maybe somebody else comes along and do it better. They'll switch gods because someone else is doing the God business better. No, they feel connected to this God who's been generous with them. That's how they should feel. No healthy person sees the generosity of anyone, say particularly of his parents, her parents, and thinks, okay, mom and dad were really good to me. They gave me a lot of stuff, but I can do better with that other mom and dad. I can switch accounts and get a better deal from another mom and dad. Now, something is wrong at heart with a person who receives generosity and doesn't respond with gratitude, with connection, with community. Generosity is God's way of creating community, connection. But there are people who are so narcissistic, so bent in on themselves, so caring only of themselves, that they assume that they deserve every good thing they've gotten. And so generosity doesn't create any community with them, any connection to the one who was generous. They take the gifts, no matter how lavish, and they say, well, what have you done for me lately? I'm looking for someone who will give me what I want next. On the past, I forget about your generosity. I want the next thing. Never mind the covenant. Never mind sparing Abraham and Jacob, delivering them from a famine by sending Joseph to Egypt. Never mind the Exodus, the honey from the rock and the yogurt or the tofu and the mutton. Never mind all that. This Baal is offering me fertility and prosperity. Well, looks like a pretty good deal from that Baal god. Never mind calling me from a dry and weary world with no life. There's no atonement. There's no forgiveness. Never mind calling me from that and giving me life and atonement and forgiveness. For giving me righteousness. Never mind that I got spared judgment. Never mind the resurrection and the new heaven and the new earth. A hope that lasts forever. Never mind all that. This mammon, this wealth, is promising me everything I want. The relationship is promising to light up my life. The world is promising me thrills and luxuries and to stuff my ego. Despite God's past generosity, these people dealt corruptly with him. He began actually back in verse 5. And they betrayed him. They betrayed the one who dealt with them as a caring father. And so they're no longer his children. At least not some of them are not. They are blemished. That is, people are not allowed to be priests, to approach him. They're crooked and twisted. What kind of people return such generosity with no sense of gratitude or relationship? Well, crooked, twisted, bent people do. They should have been Jerushan in verse 15, which is the Hebrew word just means upright one. They should have been the upright one. That's who he calls them, kind of sarcastically. They're supposedly the upright one. It's like that. But they grew fat, on all the yogurt or on all the tofu and the mutton that they were fed. They were fat and stout and sleek. The Lord was generous with them. So they prospered. Like last week, remember Cotton Mather? Godliness begat prosperity, and the daughter devoured the mother. God is generous and blesses us with the money, the house, the stuff, the family, the relationships we want. And then we make the things that He gave us into an idol. We end up seeking more money and things, or we end up serving the family over the Lord. Whatever, we turn into something we serve instead of something we use to serve the Lord. And so we betray the one who generously gave them to us. His generosity to us doesn't make us grateful to Him. It makes us fat and self-indulgent. So we kick back at Him. We forsake Him. We scoff at the rock of our salvation. In verse 15, He was reliable. He was the rock. He was reliable, solid. We weren't. Instead, they, or we, stirred the Lord to jealousy because we live for those other things besides Him. Maybe thinking that we could live for Him and those other things like wealth or the family that doesn't really want to serve the Lord, our egos. We forgot who we were dealing with. Look at our idols in verses 16 and 17. He describes these idols that we're drawn to. First, they are strange in verse 16. That is, these gods, these idols that we had not known. In verse 17, they were things that were new to us. They don't properly belong to us, and we weren't made to serve them, although that's what we're doing now. We're serving mammon or whatever. They were made to serve us. Second, they are, in verse 16, detestable. That's what it means to be an abomination. It's something that is abhorrent, something that's repulsive. It's disgusting. They may not be repulsive to us anymore, like living for the dollar. That may seem like normal. So what's so abhorrent about that? It's the way the world works. But that's because we've been conformed to a culture that's all about that. There's something wrong with us when what is detestable feels normal. Right? There's something wrong with a person. Health-wise, is able to eat something that's detestable, that's repulsive. There should be a reaction to it. There should be a reaction to us when these detestable idols tempt us. Third, the idols are demonic. In verse 17, they sacrifice to demons that were no gods. That is, they serve demonic things. Our idols come from Satan to distract us, to take our eyes off the one who was generous to us. Fourth, they are unimpressive. They don't cause dread or reverence. They don't make us tremble or give us joy. They just distract us. They just fill our attention. They make us unmindful. In verse 18, unmindful of the rock who bore us. That is, they take our minds away from the rock. We don't think about God anymore. Our mind is not on Him anymore. We may say we believe in Him, but we don't really think about Him because there's this other thing this bright, shiny thing that's distracting us. We're so focused on money making or the relationship or sports or our career or whatever that we forget about God. He's the rock who gave us birth, but we forget who we're dealing with. Who do you think you're dealing with? You think you're dealing with someone who is jealous, who has a right to be jealous, who owns you and whom you owe your life, your soul, your all. Well, next we see God's present jealousy. Now, people today usually think of jealousy as something bad because it's constraining, right? We don't want to be constrained. Jealousy is bad, we think, because we like to think we are free, and so we hate to think that we are owned by anyone, that someone else has a right to our affections and our heart to say, no, you can't do that or say that because I have that right over you. So we resent that. So we end up saying all jealousy is bad. And no one has the right to be jealous over us, but really that's wrong. If you're married, your wife or husband has a right to be jealous, to say, stop it, if you're communicating in the wrong way with someone of the opposite sex. You owe him or her attention, affection that only belongs to him or her. We owe God our life, our soul, our all, and so He is jealous when we give it to something else. He is right to be. He's already said in verse 16, in the context of that his past generosity, that our idolatry provokes his jealousy. The song then describes what that means from verses 19 to 33. His provoked, present jealousy. Our idolatry, he says, is a provocation in verse 19. And so he spurns us, like from last week. You know those times when there were only one set of footprints in the sand? That's when you were serving an idol, serving mammon. So I spurned you. I wouldn't be near you. He says in verse 20 that he will hide his face from us. It's the opposite of that blessing from Numbers that we give for our benediction. May his face shine upon you. Here he's saying, I'm hiding my face from you. Here he hides his face, his favor, his approving attention. If you're chasing some idol, he will let them reap the consequences for their choices. They're perverse and unfaithful. The lack of faithfulness being the perversity. In our culture, we think it's so normal. The people not keeping their word, not keeping their promises. We think that's the way it is. God here is saying, no, that's perverse. That's perversity to be unfaithful. Our idolatry makes him jealous, provoking his anger. So the Lord punishes by blessing others. So we'll be jealous. Ever wonder why sometimes wicked people, immoral people, pornographers or whatever they are seem to be blessed and flourish? Sometimes God's blessing them, at least for now, to provoke us. We provoked him. So now he's provoking us. You understand who you're dealing with? Describes it here. His anger is like fire. It burns down to the dead, devouring the planet, consuming everything. So he heaps up disasters on us. More disaster, another disaster. There's a tsunami, there's a tornado, there's a hurricane, here's a pandemic, heaping them up, shooting his arrows, bringing hunger and diseases and pandemics and novel coronaviruses and terrorists. No one can escape, he says. He would have wiped out his idolatrous people, but he didn't want his enemies to boast. Notice what's going on here, around verse 23 to 27. He vows, I would have wiped out my idolatrous people, but I didn't want my enemies, who were my tools in my hand, to punish them. I didn't want them to boast that they got the triumph. He didn't want to give the gates of hell the victory, because then they would boast that they won by themselves, that they prevailed. Not because the Lord was judging. In verse 27, that's the enemies of God. They are the nation without sense. They don't understand why they're triumphing over God's people. They think because they're smarter, they're more powerful. But no, it's because the God is using them. The enemies don't understand that in verses 28 to 33, that the reason that they're able to defeat us, God's people, was because God was punishing, or is punishing us through them. That's why one of them chased 1,000 of us in verse 30. Why? Why are we losing all the time? Well, because God is using them. Possible example, about 8 years ago, 2/3 of North Carolinians voted to uphold marriage between a man and a woman. And then about 2 years later, the opposite was just basically forced on us. How does that happen? How do we lose like that? Because we've been given up in verse 31. Their rock, the rock of the adversaries, what they are based on, money, pleasure, ego, whatever, is not our rock. Our enemies come from Sodom, not literally, but spiritually. They are the spirit of Sodom and Gomorrah. Their wine is poison. God, in his jealousy, gives us over to them when we serve idols. But notice, not totally. He doesn't give us totally over to them. The gates of hell still will not prevail against the church. He won't let them prevail even when we forget who we're dealing with. Who do you think you're dealing with? You think you're dealing with a God of future mercy and severity? From verses 34 to 43, we see the future mercy and severity of God. What has God laid up in store? In verse 34, vengeance is mine. He's laid that up in store. He says in verse 35, recompense. He will pay back for the time when their foot shall slip. And he's speaking about these enemies. His enemies, who he has been using to punish, to discipline his people, but he will pay them back for the time when their foot shall slip. He set that time when they will stumble and fall. That's his time. He's ordained it. God orders whatever, quote, accident that overtakes his enemies, whatever slip and fall down a staircase that breaks their neck, whatever auto accident they end up being crushed by, whatever calamity that brings their doom. That's for his enemies that he used to punish his people because of their idolatry. Now that should make us tremble when we realize that's who we're dealing with. We're dealing with a God who controls every disaster, who sets appointments that their foot's going to slip here or there. They're going to fall down the stairs here. They're going to get in a car wreck there. That's who we're dealing with. It says in verse 39, I kill and make alive. I wound and I heal. And there is none who can deliver out of my hand. He swears in verses 40 to 42 that he will take vengeance on his enemies. He'll repay those who hate him, shooting his arrows into them, pouring out their blood, chopping their flesh with a sword. Tremble when you realize that's who you're dealing with. See, he says in verse 38, see, open your eyes that I, even I, am he says. Know who you're dealing with. See. Understand that he's not the therapeutic God who carries us even when we're idolatrous. He's not a teddy bear. No, he says, there is no God beside me. Tremble. But then realize that severity on his enemies makes his mercy on his people stand out. Mercy is displayed over the backdrop of severity. He does all this severity, ordaining when foot slip, because, in verse 36, the Lord will vindicate. Vindicate means to make right, show to be right. The Lord will vindicate his people. He will show them to be right, that they were right to trust him, that they had been made right by him, for him. He will have compassion on his servants when they're the meek of the earth. When they depend on him, then he will show them, these are my people. And then he challenges us. Where are your idols now? Your precious dollars, your cars, your jewels, your gadgets, your relationships, the things you kept for yourself that belong to me. Where are they now? What good are they to you now? In verse 38, the fat of sacrifices and the wine of drink offerings, he said they kept those things for themselves, but God said they belong to me, like our money, our time, our family, our hearts. But in our idolatry, we kept it for ourselves. But now those idols can't help us. But the Lord will. The Lord will help us after destroying his enemies. So in verse 43, rejoice with him, with the Lord. Now, for all the judgment of this chapter, all his severity, this is still a happy song. Rejoice. Bow down to him. Know who you're dealing with. Even the idols that you served, make them serve the Lord, because he has mercy on his children and severity on his adversaries. While, in that last line of the song, he cleanses or atones. Literally, it says, that is, washes away, like we heard in that song. He washes away the sin of his people. He cleanses his land, his people. That is, his land is his people, his inheritance. He atones, he makes at one, he reconciles with himself. So all their sin, so all our sin is washed away. The future mercy of God. That's the song Moses and Joshua, now joined by Joshua at the very end, give to us, and that we're told to take it to heart. That's to warn us about who we're dealing with. Who do you think you're dealing with? Do you know? With trembling? and rejoicing that you're dealing with a God who kills and makes alive, who wounds and heals, who ordains when foots will slip. We have this song, so we'll know him. So we'll tremble at his word and do it. We'll enjoy his inheritance. So we'll know who this God is we say we believe in. We'll put away all our idols and we'll give to him our life, our soul, our all, and found our life on him, our rock. So we'll know finally who we're dealing with. The Rock of Ages.